To learn more about earning college credits with study hall courses, visit gostudyhall.com or click the link in the description. Hello there. I'm Rob Fuller, and this is Study Hall Modern World History. When humans create something new, it's hard to predict how much of an impact it can have. When computers were first created, people certainly didn't expect to be carrying them around in their pockets less than 100 years later, but here we are. Technology is powerful, and as new technology spreads around the world, it can advance at lightning speeds as more and more people experiment with it. So in no time, we can go from those room-sized computers down to the culture-changing microchips we have today. We've seen this happen over and over again throughout history. When a new technology spreads across the world, it can have a profound and often unexpected impact. And one of the most interesting examples comes from a simple mixture of just 3 ingredients, but 3 ingredients that would go on to rock the world. I give you gunpowder. On its own, gunpowder can't actually do much. It's basically just explosive dust. And as with all breakthroughs in technology, its widespread effects aren't its own doing since, it's an inanimate object. How we choose to use and adapt to these technologies determines their impact. Gunpowder technology is powerful, and people across the world are about to see it pop up a lot, but some will use it to conquer, others to protect, and some won't use it at all. At least not for a while. But it's important to remember when we're talking about these doors that open for humans throughout history, like big breakthroughs in technology, that we get to decide what paths we take beyond those doors. Like we said, gunpowder could not do anything on its own, but history shows us how many chose to use it to devastating effect. But beyond the violent implications of gunpowder, the story of how humans have responded to the invention of gunpowder is kind of a weird one. The earliest known use of gunpowder dates back to 9th century China, where it was seemingly an accidental discovery by alchemists searching for the elixir of immortality, and those long-dead alchemists missed it by just that much. By the 11th century, Chinese military manuals began to discuss gunpowder weapons, and gunpowder played a major role in the Song dynasty's efforts to combat northern invaders like the Jurchens and the Mongols. But that doesn't mean they were using guns. At first, gunpowder was used to turn traditional arrows into fire arrows, or stuffed into bamboo shoots to create fire lances. Then, as weapon designers became more experienced with the substance, they were able to develop iron explosives that were launched from catapults and early cannons. The ingredients to make early gunpowder were actually pretty basic: saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. Don't try this at home, kids. So once the formula for gunpowder traveled across the world through trade, other armies were also able to start producing their own gunpowder and making their own guns and cannons. As gunpowder swept across Afro-Eurasia's trade routes, it changed the way many people waged war. It might not seem obvious since early guns weren't very accurate and they took a long time to reload, but the old way of fighting depended on thick walls to defend settlements, which now gunpowder weapons made much easier to destroy. Also, combat heavily involved highly trained fighters on horseback, like what we might call a knight. And these specialized fighters had to train for years to master combat with all of that armor. While learning how to fire a gun was much faster, which meant a ruler could produce a large army quickly. Once that new army was trained to fight with that new firepower, they had a major advantage over neighboring countries that weren't using gunpowder weapons. The best examples of empires that use these new weapons and strategies are, wait for it, the Gunpowder Empires. Little on the nose if you think about it. The Gunpowder Empires were a group of empires stretching from the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean that came to power during the 15th and 16th centuries. The Ottoman, Mughal, and Safavid empires were all originally Turkic tribes who had fled their homelands there in Central Asia to escape the Mongols, and who would go on to conquer new lands. These empires had 2 important features in common. First, they were all outsiders who conquered territories and cultures very different from their own. What this meant for all 3 empires is that they had to prove to their supporters that they had legitimacy, or the right to rule. They did this by learning the languages and traditions of the people they ruled, whether this was writing Persian poetry or building mosques. Rulers like Suleiman and Jahangir promoted religious tolerance, portraying themselves as protectors of all faiths, not just their own. And that proved especially important in the Mughal and Ottoman empires, where for hundreds of years the rulers didn't share the same religious beliefs as the majority of their subjects. But the most important sign of their legitimacy was military strength. The average person wouldn't care if their leaders wrote poetry or built mosques if they were constantly being invaded. The most important part of a ruler's legitimacy was their ability to take care of their subjects. That could mean defending their borders from outside attacks or quelling rebellions inside the country. And this leads us to the second thing that all three empires had in common: the use of gunpowder to wage effective and often devastating wars against their enemies. To see these changes in action, let's focus on the Ottoman Empire, famous for their use of gunpowder and giant hats. Yeah, I gotta get me one of those. Now, for most of us, the word gunpowder immediately brings to mind, well, guns. But it's important to note that gunpowder is just as important, if not more so, when used for heavy artillery and explosives. That's the kind of stuff that made old-fashioned forts outdated, and would lead to the fall of a formerly great empire at the hands of the Ottomans. In 1451, Mehmet II became Sultan for the second time. At the age of 18, he set his sights on conquering the city of Constantinople, the last vestiges of the once powerful Byzantine Empire. By medieval standards, Constantinople was a sight to behold. Built on the edge of the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, the Byzantine capital was protected on two sides by water and on the third side by the Theodosian Walls. The Theodosian Walls were a series of 3 stone walls, each one taller and thicker than the last. The innermost wall was the biggest at more than 15 feet thick and over 36 feet tall, with guard towers about every 200 feet. In order to break through Constantinople's defenses, Mehmet needed a plan. First, Mehmet decided to attack by land since the Byzantine had a tight grip on the surrounding waters. He brought his janissaries, his top force armed with muskets, but they still had to make it past the Theodosian Walls. To break through, Mehmet had specialized bronze cannons built. The largest one weighed over 18 tons and was cast of 2 separate pieces just to make it possible to carry it anywhere. Even in 2 pieces, it took dozens of oxen more than 2 months to carry the cannon around 140 miles from Adrianople to Constantinople. These cannons were difficult to use and hard to aim, but they broke through the walls, allowing 3,000 of the Sultan's janissaries into the city. The city fell, and so did the last remnants of the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople had been such a symbol of resistance that its defeat marked the end of an era, not just for the Byzantine Empire, but for an outdated style of warfare. Armies that didn't use gunpowder weapons and tactics often faced humiliating defeats now. And as for the victors, conquering territory gave them more than just a sense of pride. More territory meant more taxes, and those taxes could be used to pay for more soldiers and more guns. And I bet you can see the cycle that's starting to form here. Successfully building a large gunpowder army could produce a huge return on investment. So yeah, gunpowder changed the way we waged wars, but at the end of the day, like a lot of things in human life, it was really all about the dosh. Empires across Afro-Eurasia were looking to start up that cycle for themselves, and the ways they chose to achieve that goal had widespread effects outside of warfare alone. The 13th to 15th centuries acted as a kind of reset button on world politics, at least in Europe and Asia. The Mongols wiped out empires like the Abbasid and the Song that had been around for centuries. In Europe, conflicts like the Reconquista and the Wars of the Roses led to new ruling dynasties. And if those changes weren't enough, the Black Death destabilized social structures across the continent. And on the heels of all that upheaval, new empires across the world emerged that wanted to grab power while they could. Gunpowder was a big part of that, but there's something potentially even stronger than gunpowder: bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is essentially a form of government where officials with direct loyalty to the emperor oversee the rules and policies. That gave the emperor much more power compared to the looser feudal system, which gave local lords more autonomy. European kings, Ottoman sultans, and Mughal shahs established bureaucracies to centralize their power by taking away some of the lords' responsibilities like collecting taxes and enforcing local laws. Instead, these would be overseen by the emperor's bureaucrats, who were often trained professional government officials. And bureaucracies could look very different from one country to another. In the past, feudal lords and local rulers collected taxes for the king or emperor, but it was basically expected that they would take their cut. By employing bureaucrats loyal only to the emperor, they ensured that more of the money went where it belonged: the empire. In Europe, rulers used royal charters to strengthen their relationships with towns, which were important because towns brought in a lot of money through trade. They further edged out the power of feudal lords by giving towns rights to their own land and property. Both of these changes meant that as a ruler grew in power, their wealth also grew. Before gunpowder, the Ottomans were just one of many tribes vying for control of the Middle East. But gunpowder changed everything. The old ways of fighting were obsolete. And this meant that feudal lords and local rulers without gunpowder weapons could no longer rely on their own army of knights to resist or ignore kings and emperors. They had to accept the changes happening. And yes, give up some of their traditional power. And as these armies grew and grew, overall, things became more expensive since the scale of warfare was larger than it had been before. But rulers were able to pay these higher bills because of their new systems of taxation and more reliable tax collectors. In some places, gunpowder led the way to centralization, and in other places, centralization provided the capital to fully take advantage of gunpowder. Regardless of which way it happened, the world was moving to a more armed and more centralized place. Centralization and military strength meant the same things to these people as it does to many today: protection and money. And that story continues throughout history. Although we said that governments became more centralized, they were nowhere near as centralized as many of the governments we have today that use public funds to make roads, pay out social security, and other social programs. Gunpowder is just the beginning of a story that's still going on today. As time moves on, many of us have made the decision to consolidate our power for the sake of protecting the whole. And getting that dosh. It seems wild that all of this came from a handful of black powder with just 3 ingredients. But it's not just the existence of gunpowder that caused the revolution, it's what people chose to do with it. And what they did changed the world. If you're enjoying Study Hall Modern World History and are interested in taking an online course and earning college credit, visit gostudyhall.com or click on the button to learn more. Thanks for watching, see you next time.